Good morning and welcome to the July edition of the Drought Hour. Today we have two speakers, it's Warren Rushce and Laura Edwards. And so just to introduce myself, I am Hector Menendez with the Department of Animal Science located in West River Ag Center here in Rapid City. And so first we'll be having Laura Edwards just giving a climate update. And so with that, Laura, I'll hand it over to you. And one more side note, sorry, Laura, is that if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to put those, and we'd be happy to make sure those get answered for you.
All right, thanks, Hector. And I believe there's a live transcript or closed captioning available for those of you who maybe have a little trouble hearing sometimes. So we have that option available for you as well. So as I've been doing about once a month, I've been sitting in the drought hour here around this time of the month to kind of give a status update in a way and an outlook of what we're seeing coming ahead the next 1 to 3 months. So fortunately, over the last month, we saw slightly cooler temperatures for a lot of us and some moisture as well, where we have seen some improvement in conditions, or maybe just less stress is the way to say it, across parts of the state, but there are still lingering drought issues for a lot of us here in South Dakota. Looking at just the temperature side to start with, this is the departure from average temperature over the last 30 days. So roughly since the last time I presented in this drought hour forum. And the color scheme here are the greens are below average, yellows to orange are near to above average temperatures. So you can kind of see how the north warmer as compared to average temperatures for the last 30 days. The southeast in particular cooler as compared to average over the last 30 days. And those yellows, light greens are really near average, not a lot different. So, we saw some very hot temperatures to end June and start early July around the 4th. And then right after the 4th of July holiday, we turned to a much cooler pattern. But that's not going to hold as we see the forecast out here the next few days coming up here. But for now, a little less heat stress, at least the last couple of weeks. As we look at precipitation over the last 30 days, and granted, these are just spot dot maps, not radar estimated. These are actually observations. So we see a few potentially bad numbers, but that look really wet, like up in Perkins County. But overall, we saw some decent moisture. Average for this time of year is about 3/4 of an inch a week, especially in the eastern part of the state and central. So we've held that would be in that 3 to 4 inch range. Would have been average for this time of year. So looking at that 2 to 4 inch range in the greens, close to average, but we still do see areas that had maybe an inch or so up in the north and the west. So really, really dragging behind average still. Percent, if you want to look at that as a percent of average precipitation, again, over the last 30 days, just since last time I presented with you, you see several red dot areas, less than 50% of average here for the last month. When you look at greens, blues, purples, those are wetter than average. So we see some of that in the hills, especially in the North Hills, and some scattered areas in the central and eastern side of the state. But I do realize too, it's very local with the kind of thunderstorms that we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of widespread rain, at least we haven't yet this season. Along with that too, we've seen relatively little severe weather. I know the Sioux Falls Forecast Office, the National Weather Service office there, really hasn't issued much in tornado warnings this last season so far, this current season so far, I should say. So we're not seeing a lot of hail damage. I know we've seen some out west. I believe it was that Newell area. Saw some hail damage and some others in the south central, but it's been relatively isolated and pretty quiet, severe weather-wise. Soil moisture, this is as of just recently over the last couple days here, looking at soil moisture as of this morning. And you can see the wetter areas are blue, darker areas are green. This is our poker chip map showing multiple levels at each weather station with the mesonet. And you see some areas now turning green. We saw a lot more yellows and oranges a month ago. But I'll say too, with these kind of wetting rains, we see a short term, flush and moisture, wetness, but then eventually, that moisture is lost either through vegetation, evaporation, or infiltration through the soil. So whatever short-term gains we see at the surface, at the shallow layers, doesn't hold very long, as you see a lot of yellow discs on that top layer. But I'd say slightly, improvement, especially in the south central and southeastern part of the state. And the northwest is kind of holding in there, as I've seen a handful of rain events lately. When we look at the whole profile, another way to look at this is regionally using a new NASA, the NASA Sport model, which looks at soil moisture, and they have this new tool that we can look at, and this is just centered over the Dakotas, looking at how much soil moisture do we have in that 0 to 100 centimeter level, and obviously very dry as a percent. This is percent for this time of year. A lot of areas in the north central part of north central South Dakota, and a lot in the southeast as well, looking at 10% of average for this time of year, maybe drier. You see some isolated areas of wetness there in Clark and Day County and out west that are more like maybe 30%, 25 to 30% of average. So really still not very wet, but just another perspective here to show how dry the soils are as we get into this week, which I think most of us know is gonna be hot and dry, and especially on the crop side, they really are in a moisture intensive phase, especially corn, which needs about a third of an inch of water a day at this point, as it's in the pollination stage. And so if we don't get rain, it has to draw from the soil, and there's just not a lot of water there available for corn at this point. Looking at the drought monitor situation now to kind of get a snapshot of where we are. Again, this is updated every week in Thursday morning. So we've seen some ups and downs, and I'll show in a couple slides the changes we've seen over the last 4 weeks, but still holding on with D3 extreme drought in some part of the state. D2 also severe drought. That's maybe like a 5 and 100 year kind of event, about every 20-year return interval, something like that. So we are seeing some pretty severe conditions still holding on across much of South Dakota and our neighboring states as well, to the north and west of us. To zoom in here a little bit closer, we've been hanging in there about 15 to 20% of the state in D3, that extreme category, for about 3 months now. So it's been, really severe. And I know the kind of reports that we're hearing are, livestock water, stock ponds dried out, having to haul water, of course, hay shortages, forage shortages, alfalfa and spring wheat and winter wheat issues. So we're hearing a multiple impact kind of thing. And, even look at the Missouri River itself, they are at the Army Corps of Engineers also starting to implement some of their first early drought restrictions, drought conservation measures, which I think first is looking at the navigation season. So nothing severe yet as far as water restrictions on the Missouri River itself, but if you've been there, you could tell the water really is down quite a bit from what we've been used to the last few years. Looking at the Drought Monitor Map and how much it's changed over the last 4 weeks. So green areas have improved. Yellows, oranges have degraded or downgraded, worsened, I should say. So we've seen, pockets of areas that have some improvement by one category, one class, and a mixed bag there of worsening areas. So really kind of all over the board. Again, as they take this week by week, they're reevaluating the situation every week. Looking at a couple of the more agriculture related things. So first of all, looking at spring wheat, this has gotten a lot of news lately as far as how hard it's been hit by the drought, especially in the spring season with the dryness. This is a condition index that a colleague of mine at USDA puts together. This is the last 20 years crop condition. And so he takes the Monday reports from NASS and looks at what percent of poor, fair, good, and excellent, and he has a multiplier. So excellent times 4, good times 3, fair times 2, and poor times 1. And so he calculates this index, basically figuring out what crop condition, kind of put a number on crop condition overall. And again, this is nationally, but spring wheat's really just grown in the Dakotas and Montana, so really targeting our area. And that's the red line. That's 2021 as of last week, the 20th. That blue line that we see just above that right here, that was 2017, which I remember was a very tough year for spring wheat that year. We haven't ever in this current growing season been as good condition as we ever were at any given point, rather, in 2017. So I know it's been a very tough, very tough season for spring wheat, and I've seen that up in my area too, in Brown County and the surrounding area, just how challenging it's been this year. And I know a lot of guys have already taken action, already decided, if they cut or if they're going to try to harvest for grain and so on. Just to compare, last week's NASS report to 1988. So, as far as temperatures go in June, we were comparing a lot to 1988. That was the last month we had any heat issues or dryness issues any drought like we've seen this year. So that's kind of becoming our comparison year as we look at how this drought has unfolded. So looking at the top numbers, that was last week's NASS report, and then that little snapshot below was 1988. Again, that NASS report. So this last week in South Dakota, we had 32% very poor, 38% poor. Back in 1988, this week or last week in 1988 in South Dakota, we had 23% very poor and 50% poor. So very similar crop conditions overall, just to give you some perspective on that. Pasture and range is another area where I know there's been some really severe impacts here. And it's kind of been, in retrospect now, a couple different factors. Certainly it's been dry over the spring and early summer. But looking back as how the season has progressed, in May, we actually were relatively cool. Some of you may remember we had some freezes there right before Memorial Day at the end of the month of May, and then a very rapid turnaround towards very extreme hot temperatures in June, with 100-degree days and that kind of thing. Really contracted our growing season as far as temperature goes. We never really hit that sweet spot for a while, to allow those grasses to grow. They went right from cool and kind of slow emerging, slow growing, maybe 2 or 3 weeks behind, and then all of a sudden they matured out, and then, partly due to drought, partly due to temperature, cured out very quickly. So here we are as far as looking at pasture and range condition for 2021 is the red line you see at the bottom on the left. Right now, we're more closely comparing to 2017 for this time of year, slightly above 2008. And for those of you who have been in the Dakotas a while, that 02 to 08 period was really tough, especially in the western part of the state. So that's kind of the ballpark that we're sitting in right now as far as pasture and range conditions go, for a comparison over the last 20 years anyway. So unfortunately, we don't see a whole lot of improvement. I know it's a little too late for spring wheat and pasture and range, but hopefully for corn and soybeans and some of our other row crops, we could still have a little turnaround, hopefully. And I know this last week we saw some rain. Some people were really surprised by the amount they got, which is good, a good surprise, I believe. The next 7 days in the northern part of the state still looks pretty dry. Best chances of rain over the next 7 days will be over the south central, the southeast, kind of along that Nebraska border, along the Missouri River down that way. Right now looks like maybe totals of 1 inch to 1.5 inches, maybe in some areas. But again, that's a little above average for this time of year. So all of that would help for sure. But I think the north still is going to struggle to catch some really good rains over the next 7 days. Along with that, very extreme high temperatures. And if you don't already, I would urge you to follow the National Weather Service. Go to their website, follow them on social media. They've been putting out a lot of information on the upcoming heat for today through Wednesday. Out west, we're going to see high temperatures approaching 110 degrees. Even in the east, northeast, we're going to see highs about 100 on Wednesday, and 90s all across the board the next couple days. So I'd really encourage you to take a lot of precautions, whatever you can. I know it's hard on animals, it's hard on people, and water is a very limited resource, but with this extreme high heat, and we've got some humidity now, which is different than what we had in June. We've had a little rain and we're having a little more humid nights, especially in the east. So that's where I think maybe Warren can mention too, some of the livestock stress concerns as well. 8 to 14 days, as we look out the 1 to 2 weeks from now. And these two maps, at least on the weekend, are computer generated. So there's no human forecaster involved in these two maps on the weekends. But you see pretty strong indication here on the left. Warmer than average temperatures really going to hold on through the first week of August through the 8th. On the right, odds slightly leaning towards drier than average, kind of continuing that pattern for the next week. You see that kind of wetter area emerge in the green over the Central Rockies area, North Central Rockies. In the following week, we see we see that kind of as a pattern the next 1 to 2 weeks. So we'll see if we can get some of that moisture up this way, but typically this time of year, moisture comes from the south, not from the west. So I think, again, kind of limited chances for moisture, especially if we're under that warm heat dome again in the first week of August. As we look towards August overall, very high likelihood of warmer than average temperatures, especially over the northern Rockies again. That's kind of filtering over our area of the north central states. And again, favoring drier than average or below average precipitation on the right, including basically western South Dakota, western North Dakota, and Montana, with the highest probability, the highest likelihood of that. So again, kind of more of the same, unfortunately, as we look at heat and dry conditions, really prolonging our drought, maybe worsening in some areas in the next month. August through October, looking at 3-month periods, so looking at end of summer into fall, really still holding on to warmer than average temperatures and slightly leaning towards drier below average precipitation. So not as high confidence in the precipitation outlook there in the fall, but a hint at maybe what's ahead of us. As I know, August is really critical moisture for soybean crop in particular, not just corn. So I know a lot of eyes are looking at this, and I'd say with a little bit of concern maybe. I think timely rains are going to be really critical, kind of what we've seen the last couple of weeks. Some timely rains maybe can hold off the worst impacts in the ag sector, in the agriculture sector. So with that, I could take some questions, Hector, if there's any in the Q&A or chat, or we can pass it off to Warren.
Hi, thanks so much, Laura. We do not have any questions from the chat, but again, to the audience, please feel free. Even though Laura's done presenting, we can circle back at the end of Warren's presentation for any climate questions. Again, thank you, Laura. And now we'll switch to Warren Rushce, and he will be presenting about drylotting decisions. So
Hey,
Warren,
Hector,
oh, yes,
I
Connie.
need to share that QR code real quick.
Oh, sure thing.
Oh, wrong one. Hold on.
So for our audience, Connie is just pulling up a QR code and she'll explain that.
All right, sorry about that. Hopefully for those that need it, you can see the QR code. These are for the CCA continuing education credits. So if you are in need of those credits, please pull out your mobile device, open up that CCA app and scan this QR code. We'll have it up here for just a little bit, as this is the only time that this QR code will be shown. Kind of give you a few more seconds here to get that QR code scanned. All right, well, I'm going to stop that share. And at the end of Warren's presentation, we'll have another QR code. So I will pop back in to share it then. Thank you.
Okay, Warren, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Hector. We're going to start, and please stop me. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking when I do this to make sure am I sharing the correct screen? So I'm counting on the rest of my panelists to shout something out if I'm not. But I was asked to talk about drought management strategies as it relates to our beef cattle enterprises and how that might fit in, how early weaning and drylotting might fit in as well. Laura brought up a short discussion about heat stress. I don't have anything specifically prepared for that, but I noticed she did in the chat box share the link to go out to our livestock stress tool that's as part of the Mesnet website. That's really a valuable resource to let people get a forecast of what their livestock may be experiencing experiencing in terms of risk of environmental stress. Right now, that would be heat, and we have some resources on our website as well to help producers mitigate that. But as she outlined, the fact that we have more humidity with increased temperatures certainly elevates our risk compared to what we experienced in June. We really, from a feedlot cattle standpoint, we really dodged some bullets in June. With the temperatures we had, it could have been much, much worse if we'd have had something like more normal moisture and humidity conditions. The fact that we were dry, although is a problem from a feed supply and crop standpoint, really did help our livestock tolerate the environmental conditions they were dealing with at that time. So what we're really though getting at, and what I'm going to try to address with the half hour or so that I've been given, is how do we balance out forage supply and demand for the next few months and then going out into the year. So some of the things that we'll talk about today include early weaning. We'll talk a little bit about drylotting, which could mean either on your own operation or having someone else do that on a custom basis. Then we'll talk a little bit also about how we might salvage some crops, then use livestock to turn those crops into cash resources. The challenge with all of this, and this is at least the third drought that I've worked with since I came back to Extension about 10 years ago. The challenge is always that, at least from a livestock standpoint, there really aren't any simple answers. Every single one of these situations is different. And what we need to do depends a great deal on what does your cash flow look like, how many head of livestock are we dealing with, what kind of feed stuff availability might we have. This year, there's going to be a major difference between the haves and have-nots, so to speak, depending on how our corn crop progresses. We could end up in some scenarios where in some parts of the state, producers have more feed than they almost know what to do with, because if there were some challenges with the corn crop development in other areas, where that may not be an option. So my overall theme is going to be really to discuss general concepts and ideas rather than a site specific plan that someone could take home and say, this is what SDSU said I ought to do. Before I move into some of the other options, I want to talk just a little bit about creep feeding. I know that in these kind of conditions, that's a tool a lot of people reach for. And in this year, with shorter supplies of grass, there is a possibility to have better than average feed conversions using creep feed, and it certainly is a good way to transition calves from weaning, to get them used to eating dry feedstuffs. I think the misnomer and the myth, though, is that it really doesn't reduce feed intake, or forage intake, I should say. For one thing, the cows keep right on milking. The calves might not reduce forage intake to any great extent. And in fact, as they get bigger, they may actually increase. That the milk supply plus creep feed may not be enough to completely meet all of the dry matter they would voluntarily consume. So they may end up actually, as they get larger, may end up actually increasing forage intake. And Adele Hardy has done some of her master's work on creep feeding, and she and I, when we were discussing this, were on the same page that creep feeding may not be the solution that some people think it might be, from a standpoint of sparing grass and or keeping cows in condition suitable for next fall as we move into thinking about preparing for the calf crop of 2022. Another possibility is supplemental feeding on pasture. And this has been a concept we haven't explored for a while, because in some sense, I first presented this as a possibility about 10 years ago, last time we were dry. And at that time, distillers was really relatively inexpensive. So that idea of mixing some things like a low quality roughage, such as wheat straw, with wet distillers to grazing pairs looked attractive. And in certain situations that may still work, because the Nebraska researchers' results showed that it did reduce grass intake while maintaining performance. The question's going to be, is that an economical approach? And I'll touch on why here in a few slides later, but that may be one of the factors that limits how useful this strategy might be. So that's going to move us into what one of the things I was asked to address, and that's the idea of early weaning. I defined early weaning, or I think from a practical standpoint, I mean, certainly you can find cases where people have weaned, extremely early. I look at it from a practical standpoint, looking at calves that are 90 to 100 days or older as being candidates to being weaned off the cow. Um, my personal experience with this is we did this a fair bit with cows that in our operation we knew we didn't want to hang over for one more year. So what we would hold those in their own pasture, and then as calves got old enough, we'd split pairs off, sell cows in the summer weigh up cow market, which is usually attractive, and then transition those calves onto harvested feed stuff. And we also did quite a bit of weaning April-born calves in late September. And one of the reasons, at least in our experience, why we like doing that is, while the early fall conditions can be more variable in terms of temperature with larger swings, we don't very often see those very cold and wet conditions that we often do in late October and into November. And personally, I would rather deal with having to think about hotter conditions, perhaps, or more variable temperatures in early fall. That's much easier as a cattle manager to deal with than when we have wet and mud and slop and snow and all the other things that we can have happen in November. And at this age, we don't necessarily have to make a great deal of changes in terms of diet compared to how we might otherwise normally start calves. If you think about it, that 120-day-old calf, a lot of those are going to be in the close to 400, 450 pound range. So they're really not that different than what we may have been used to weaning 15, 20 years ago, at least in terms of size. I think one of the key benefits of earlier weaning is the impact that it has on the cow herd, more so, and feed supply, even more so than on the calves. By weaning off the calf, we reduce forage demand by 25% or more. If in part because once we wean the calf, we stop milk production, which reduces nutrient needs and reduces her voluntary feed intake. So from one standpoint, if we're thinking of the cow-calf enterprise in a big picture, we have the potential to use earlier weaning as a technique to reduce overall feed costs, provide some additional resiliency, particularly in a year like this, as a way to help weather some challenging economic conditions. These I added these at the last minute. And please don't take these necessarily as gospel. I would certainly encourage anyone considering earlier weaning calves to talk with their nutritionist to help develop a plan that fits their resources, their calves, their facilities, and so forth. But in speaking in big generalizations, we're going to be looking at a fairly high quality diet, about 16% crude protein, 70% TDN. If my advisors on graduate school saw me using TDN, some of them would come out of their chair, but I don't think they're on this call today. So we're going to use this one instead as a shorthand to represent a relatively high quality diet that's going to be somewhere around 50 to 60% grain, or it should also say grain byproducts or concentrates. Another 10 or 20% of that diet is going to consist of things that are higher protein concentrates, like the oilseed meals, distillers, and so forth. And then the balance of that's going to be a high quality roughage. And then, of course, we want to supplement that with vitamins, trace minerals, all of the other macro minerals that we need. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of veterinarians that I listen to, that should also include some medication for coccidiosis control, unless our program is a drug-free or antibiotic-free program that would preclude us from doing that. If we have that option, I think that's critically important, as coccidiosis is really an unseen thief of cattle performance early on during the starter phase. With all of those guidelines put in mind, one thing to keep in mind is that cheap feed can be incredibly expensive if we can't get calves to start well, or if we end up battling other health issues that plague us for the rest of the feeding period. So I tell people I am a product of the 1980s, which means I am hardwired to be cheap. So when I say don't necessarily go for the cheap option, I do so for a very important reason. This is not the time to look at a complete and total least cost diet. We need to think about meeting their nutrient needs. In some cases, that may mean providing some additional investment in feedstuffs during the initial portion of the calf starting period on these early wean calves. From a management standpoint, our most important and the cheapest nutrient we can provide is water. And if we put things really simply, if they don't drink water, they're not going to eat. If they're not going to eat, we increase our risk of cattle getting sick, and we certainly reduce our performance and feed efficiency. One of the things, though, to keep in mind, especially on early wean calves, is do they recognize what a waterer is? In some cases, they might not. And so we might need to do some things like perhaps we let the water run over for a day or so they hear that trickling and recognize that is a water source. One of the more ingenious approaches that one of our allied industry reps had shared with me that one of her producers used was someone bought one of those really cheap solar powered garden pond bubblers that that people will use to just create or a bird water. I'm not even sure what they use them for, but what they do is they just they pump a small amount of water and they just let that run inside the tank to create the noise and the sights of running water, and they use that as a way to entice calves to come up to drink. Couldn't give you a firm answer as to how well that worked, but it's certainly not an expensive approach. And again, if it gets a few of those more timid cattle up to the water, it may well be worth it. One of the things everyone is concerned about in years like this is dust, and it certainly can be a real issue. I wouldn't, though, use that as a reason to avoid earlier weaning or the sole reason anyway to avoid earlier weaning. Couple of things that we can do to help manage that is reduce the amount of space the calves have. The larger the area that's in that pen, the more area they can walk around. That hoof action reduces those soil particles down to a fine powder, which creates dust, which then they kick up by wandering around the pen. So if we reduce that to a smaller amount, say approximately 60 square foot per head, which if you think about it, if we have about a foot of bunk space, means we may have a temporary back fence 60, 70 feet back to force those cattle into a smaller area. That's going to reduce the amount of the fine particles that they can create. In more extreme conditions, we might need to apply some water to the soil, which also would help alleviate some heat stress. If we're weaning calves in August through the first half or so of September, where that can be a real issue, that may be an instance where one management technique can solve two problems. As always, we want to keep stress down to a minimum, especially with these light calves, because they're, as I would call them, you got to handle them just a little bit more tender, loving care than, perhaps a 600 pounder in December that's seen a little more of life on the pasture. We want to make sure, I mentioned already the 1 foot of bunk space, but the other question is to make sure they have access. In some cases, some of the bunk designs we have, they're created for larger feedlot cattle, and a 400-pound calf might not be able to get to all of his feed. So I know in certain cases, people have done some created some innovative or outside the box thinking, where they put some like sheet metal inserts inside fence line bunks to force some of the feed to be over towards the back of the pen, or back of the bunk rather, so that calves have better access to it. If it's feasible in your operation, fence line weaning works really, really well. Works especially well if you've got an area of better quality pasture that you can provide for the calves, where the cows are on the other side of the fence. But regardless of what kind of method we're using, we want to make sure that these facilities are jailbreak proof. These light calves can be pretty ingenious at finding the one weak spot there is in your fence or your bunk design. So we need to be thinking about the possibility of what might happen if something gets out. The morning when you show up and the weaning pen is silent because they all found a way out and are back out with the cows, that's a longer day than what you were planning on. So if whatever we might do to walk those pens and just kind of think like a small calf, see where they might be able to slip away. I'm going to shift gears a little bit into dry lotting of either pairs and or the cow herd. From just a management standpoint, one of the differences is we want to make sure we got plenty to almost excessive amount of bunk space, especially if we're dealing with pairs. 30 to 36 inches and maybe even more if we have calves at side. Um, we need to do a really good job of bunk management if we're feeding high grain diets. And I'm going to show a couple examples of how we might use limit fed high grain diets to lower feed costs. But going along with that, we're going to need to do a really good job of managing intake, controlling how we manage bunks to prevent acidosis issues. Stealing this idea from the folks at the Carrington Research Center in North Dakota. They've done probably as much work with dry letting cows as anyone in the country. One of their strategies has been that they'll provide in the bunk a total mixed ration that provides nearly all of the animal's nutrient requirements. And then in the back of the pen, they'll have a self feeder with some low quality, cheap crop residue. Now we can debate whether or not we're going to have cheap crop residue this year or not, but assuming that we do have some, they have those in the back of the pen that cattle can just eat to keep themselves occupied, satisfy their desire to for room and fill, if nothing else, but do so in a manner that still meets their needs without increasing costs. One of the challenges, though, that I see with dry lotting is it's just not so simple this year as it has been other times. A lot of these slides that I'm presenting, I'm reusing because I presented some of the same information in 2017 because during the drought conditions that year, the only thing that's changed in this slide's been the prices. 4 years ago, we were looking at corn or at hay, rather, either side of $100, corn about $100 a ton, and then distillers at about $100 a ton. When I was putting this together last night, the hay auction in Corsica had alfalfa, $200 was catching most of that. Grass hay up to about $165. Using one of our local bids for new crop corn, calculate that out on a per ton basis, it's $176 for corn. And according to the USDA for dried distillers, current price is $172 for distillers grains. So from that standpoint, we don't have some of the less expensive feed options that we did the last time we were having this discussion, which is from a cost standpoint makes things more challenging. One of the considerations I think is as we think about if we need to do some dry lotting, is we may need to do some outside the box thinking in order to control costs. These are just three very simple comparisons for late gestation cow, and I picked late gestation because that's what I had already figured out. All I needed to do is update the prices. But also I could argue that if we got cows in mid gestation from a system standpoint, we should be having those cattle graze or graze crop residues or do something much cheaper than being a dry lot, considering what their needs are. But option number one on the leftmost column would be something very, very commonly done in terms of feeding hay. 5 pounds of alfalfa, 5 pounds of grass hay. And you can see when I using those values in the cost column, come up with a cost per day of $2.56. If we do some things with a more limited feeding amount of feed, using higher energy ingredients, we can cut those costs. The option in the middle, use grass hay along with silage and distillers. And then the third, we're using nearly $5 corn plus grass hay plus distillers. Both of those were considerably less expensive than relying on hay, which would be more of the traditional feed stuff. I didn't explore any other options like, what would happen if we substituted in straw or did some other, things to try to maybe take the grass hay out, because just thinking of how variable grass hay could be, that feed valued at almost the same as alfalfa makes me concerned that perhaps that's the overvalued feed in this mix, and we want to think about using some other feedstuffs. But this is so it's not necessarily a specific prescription, but maybe more as a starting point for a discussion of how we might look at some alternatives as a way to control costs. Some other options, and this is very much going to be dependent upon where you're at, what kind of rainfall we have, and what your options might be. But some other options from a cost standpoint that could be used would be making greater use or maximal use of crop residues or annual forage if we're blessed enough to have some moisture in time that we could actually plant something. And I realize on annual forage, as our window is closing rapidly, it may not be an option at all, but perhaps there may be some opportunities with some fall seeded cover crops to capture a few days. I am convinced, though, on the crop residue side, as I drive around eastern South Dakota and into central South Dakota, that there will be places with at least corn good enough to be harvested, which opens up some opportunities to use that as a forage resource. The picture on the left was from a producer in north central South Dakota, where their heifers are developed on corn stalks with about 7 pounds of alfalfa per head per day. Makes a really effective program for them in terms of heifer development, and certainly a lower cost option. I'm going to touch on nitrates, about 3 slides worth, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail because as I'm watching the clock, I'm getting closer to perhaps the end of our hour, but it is certainly a concern with drought stress forages. And from a biological standpoint, essentially the plant is taking up nitrogen out of the soil, but it can't turn it into plant protein. Once the animal consumes those nitrates, they're converted to nitrite. Excess nitrite interferes with oxygen. And essentially, the animal can't transport nitrogen, oxygen anymore, and then dies. This table I know has been reproduced in other areas, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it, other than to say the risk depends on the dose. And at a lower level, we're fine. We can feed that. As we get to higher levels, we start having some more challenges with either bred cattle or to the point that it's toxic that we can't feed. One thing to keep in mind is we're thinking about things like cover crops and so forth. All of these recommendations were done using harvested feeds. There's some data that questions whether or not how well these recommendations might apply to cover crops. So it becomes a tougher, more challenging area to produce a recommendation. But if you are dealing with grazing some cover crops and wanted to ask more specifically about what that risk might be, encourage you to reach out to any of us with an extension, or I know Adele has been working on this area also. From a standpoint of how do we deal with nitrates, testing is our friend. From a harvest standpoint, the more of the plant we leave in back to testing, we have a couple options, either lab testing or the quick test, which works particularly well, in my opinion, with if we're harvesting things that are going to go to hay. We want to use silage whenever we can, just because the fermentation process does tend to reduce the amount of nitrates that are left in the feed. And we want to also be really careful right after a rain. Because what will happen is, as we get some additional soil moisture, that might encourage some plant growth. But if we don't have enough moisture for that nitrate to be incorporated into the plant protein, we might actually deal with a situation where it's even worse than what it might have been had it not rained. From a salvaging drought stress crops, and in this case, I'm mostly thinking about corn because that is the feed stuff that gives us the most options. I think by and large, our small grains, the die's already been cast on that crop. We've made the decision that either already been harvested for forage or we're going on for grain. From a corn standpoint, silage is the best option. Even some pretty drought stress feed still has relatively high feed value, maybe 60 to 90% as compared to normal corn. And as I talked about earlier, if we go through the siling process, we have the potential to reduce nitrates. We can also cut a little bit higher to leave more nitrates in the field, because the lower portion of the plant is the part of the corn plant that accumulates nitrates to the greatest degree. I'm going to go through quickly in these last few. We get this question from time to time: can we salvage corn by baling? The short answer to this is that's not a good idea. We did try this 10 years ago in 2012, or 9 years ago in 2012, when we were dry at the Southeast farm. We tried wrapping to create baleage. Really didn't work all that great. product was hard to handle. But the aspect that I think is the most makes me want to say most supports my statement that we don't want to salvage this by baling was our dry hay control. That year we did bale up some dry corn to create hay. We could do it, but we needed to let that hay lay for 30 days in order to get dry enough. So you can think about all of the bad things that can happen in between the time it was cut to when we actually got it wrapped up. It just doesn't lend itself well. In my opinion, if you're looking to convert corn into something like manure without having to go through the work of feeding it to livestock, then baling it up too wet would certainly do that. But I don't like this as an approach. Trying to bale it is a way to salvage that. I'm going to briefly. Feed shrink is really our big concern this year. Because we either need to stretch feed supplies if it's short, or if we end up having to salvage more acres of silage than we otherwise would have, and more tons of silage than we wanted. Here's an opportunity to stockpile feed. We need to store it longer. What we have to be concerned about is the 2021 crop will be more variable than what we're used to, and some of the book values or copy shop values aren't really going to fit very well. We need to harvest that at the right time, at the right moisture. One thing to keep in mind is drought stress corn will be wetter than you think it is just by looking. It can be pretty brown and burned up looking, and it still will retain a lot of moisture, which was the case in our 2012 experiment baling corn stalks. That corn was a lot wetter than we thought it was. So we want to make sure we're doing all of the other things that go into making a good silage product: inoculant, packing well, covering it, controlling shrink, waste, and then test that. Part of that test includes silage moisture, or testing for moisture. Whether you use the old coaster unit or the microwave unit, either method will work fine. We just want to make sure that as we're starting to chop this corn that looks like it perhaps might have burnt up a bit, we want to make sure we know what the final moisture was. This is my contact information in terms of address, email, and phone number. That concludes what I had. So from that, I will stop sharing, and we will open it up things for questions.
Does anyone have a quick question for Warren? I'm not seeing any questions at the moment in the Q&A or the chat. So at this time, I would ask Matt to open the poll. And we have two quick questions that we would love to have you all answer. This will help us to determine information that we're bringing forward with these webinars, and help our presenters come up with topics and presentations, and kind of just put together other educational information. So would really appreciate you to fill that out. And then once the poll is done, I will share that QR code for those that need the QR code for the CCA continuing education credits.
Hey, Warren, I have a question while we have a minute here. I've already had a couple of people mention winter season ahead of us, and thinking ahead if this drought continues, at least into the early spring or early summer of next year. Any considerations or thoughts to kind of prepare ourselves in the event that might happen?
Sure. And some of the things we talked about, I think then the big concern is going to be feed supply and, the economics of what do we need to do from a feed standpoint. So some of the things I talked about, the whole silage issue, that could have been a half-hour presentation on its own. But in my view, a lot of what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting up a lot of silage in a lot of parts of the state. And one of the challenges then is going to be, how do we make sure we capture and save as much value as we can? So if you have not covered silage piles in the past, this would be an outstanding time to start. Some of the other things to do would be, as I mentioned earlier, that, our traditional model of, feeding a cow herd in the winter is, well, we're going to feed them some hay. But hay is in short supply, and it's valuable, whether we're trying to sell it, buy it, or have it on inventory. So we might want to look at what are some other opportunities do we have to maybe incorporate some other feedstuffs. This might be the winter where if we do have access to a TMR mixer wagon, that may pay for itself, or go at least a long ways towards paying for itself this year. The other parts, and I know Adele and others have touched on some of the things on culling and other considerations, that one of the things we may want to look at is looking at what our inventory of cattle we have on hand. Are all of them great candidates to be continue to own as we get into winter and spring? So this would be the year I would, I talk about the three O's and maybe the U, the old, the open, the ornery, and the ugly. What cows do I have on inventory that if someone else owned them, I would be really happy about? This is the year to trim some of those off to be a bit more strategic on what we have on inventory. But you're right, Laura, this is, we've seen this enough where, we all hope this will break sometime. Tomorrow would be wonderful, but fall would be almost as good. Or, and in some ways, what we could have is the perfect storm of a bit short on feed going into winter. Then we get this, a really nasty, brutal winter that then all the snow melts, maybe fills up the stock dams, but does us no other good. And I'm old enough to remember 1976. That's kind of what some of those years looked like. So, it's a very valid concern to be thinking about, how do we get through till what we all hope is better growing conditions in 2022.
Yeah, and I'll add, just from a climate standpoint, I didn't present this earlier in the hour, but we're starting to get hints of La Nina conditions in the winter, which doesn't tell us really much about precipitation, but it does lean us towards colder temperatures, especially in the late winter, say late January, February, early March kind of time frame. So there's a couple hints that we could see a cold streak there this winter as well, which could increase, the feed demand.
Which, and that brings me to another point that I talked about earlier. If we think about things as a system standpoint, to me, that's one of the reasons why earlier weaning can be such a powerful tool. If we reduce her nutrient intake requirements, for the fall, and if we have the opportunity for some cheap feedstuffs like corn stalks, cover crops, if we get a little shots of regrowth on small grain, any of those things that are opportunities rather than necessarily relying on pasture or stored feed. If we can build up a body condition reserve on her going into the worst of the winter, that gives us some additional resiliency as we're going into the rest of the winter and into spring. So we're really, from a cow herd manager standpoint, yes, we've got the 2021 calf on the ground that we need to be thinking about marketing and how do we sell him and manage him. But in a lot of respects, we're everything what we're doing is designed for the 2022 calf that we're just in the process of creating through the breeding season.
I encourage you to keep the questions coming. I just wanted to pop in quick to share the QR code for Warren's presentation for those that need it for the CCA continuing ed credits. So I'll give you a few more moments here to get that code scanned. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop that share, and please keep those questions coming.
So as we give it a few more seconds or minutes to wrap this up, I'd like to thank Dr. Rushce and Laura Edwards for presenting. and we really appreciate your time today. For the audience, please reach out to them through email or follow up. It doesn't end here. And there are, as Laura and Warren mentioned, there are lists of or number of resources to help you dive deeper into specifics related to cattle or climate considerations. And so with that, if there's no other questions, I think we'll conclude our drought hour unless Warren or Laura, you have anything, any last burning comments for the audience. Okay, well, thanks so much, and stay tuned for our drought seminar series in August. And once again, thank you so much and have a good day.